This is Eugene White, and welcome to the March 13th International Macro History online seminar. And today we have a discussion of narrative macro history in the 21st century. I thought to start off, I would give a brief introduction, which might be more useful for more junior people. And I'm going to try to share my screen if that's possible. There we go. Okay. So, oops. Yeah. So, as many of you know, there's a kind of tension in economic history between what I'll call the traditional or narrative economic history, which usually tells a linear story with less explicit hypotheses and a lot of inductive reasoning, usually from primary sources, including all variables, as we'd say, even if they're not well defined. And books tend to be the primary way of spreading one's results. And then there's the cliometric way, of course, with economic analysis divided largely by deduction, with explicit hypotheses tested parsimoniously using econometric methods. Most of the time, you have short articles. But the question is, these two sort of approaches kind of diverge. And most of us have been, especially for promotion and tenure, have been worried about producing economic articles for economics journals. And if we use this approach, the question is really, do we fail to deliver our findings to the largest audience or the audience most important? And Robert Schiller would argue that we lose our most effective means if we're not offering potent narratives. And one of the questions is, to what degree are these two approaches mutually exclusive? And who do we want to reach? Do we want to try and reach journalists and policymakers who might be more affected by books or economics? And how should we teach our undergraduates and graduate students if we only pursue the cliometric method? What's our role in the departments? So today we'll have a wonderfully distinguished panel, and I've decided to highlight three books by each one of them, which I found to be really very popular with my undergraduates. Sebastian Edwards' book on American default. One student told me she was asked at a interview by a major consulting firm about the best book she read, and she'd read this from my class and explained it. And one of the interviewers said, "That's great." He took down notes, and she got the job right away. And Tobias's 1931 book, many students have seen parallels with today and thought it was great. And Larry's book about the incredible backstage activities in one of the great bubbles also was a very popular book. So I thought I'd start out by talking about two concerns. One where I think I have a solution to this question about where narrative belongs, and one where I'm not so clear. So just as way of kicking off, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 had separated commercial from investment banking and kept the two apart till 1999. And I assigned two readings to my undergraduates. One in Edward Morris's chapter in his book on Ferdinand Pecora, who was the leader of the congressional hearings on the use of securities affiliates by commercial banks to do investment banking. And he emphasized deceptions and manipulations by some of the leading banks. And this is the narrative which still dominates much of the media. I also give them a paper by Randy Krosner and Raghu Rajan, which looks at all the bonds, the universe of bonds issued by commercial investment banks, the combined two, and it shows that they were less risky, less likely to fail, and exposed to fewer losses compared with standalone investment banks. And this is the article which has convinced most economists. So you have a real divergence. Now, I asked my students, can these two be reconciled? It doesn't matter whether it's an undergraduate or graduate class, there's generally silence. And the way I sort of approach it is that the narrative oftentimes hits the outliers in terms of thinking econometrically. And that raises an important question of, do tough cases, which fill the media, make bad law? And that allows us to talk more about that question and also about political economy. So I find that actually nicely marries this narrative with the econometrics. But for myself, I've been working on the Barings crisis of 1890. And when I gave this paper, the Rutgers macro seminar, even though it challenges the Bagehot's rule and talked about it in a very modern sense, dead silence in the room. It was not clear to me that they couldn't see the importance of a single case and looked in detail or what. So I'm not sure whether to approach this in terms of a book or articles. So that's my dilemma, and I thought I'd put that sort of things I find difficult. But I'd like to start off today first with Sebastian Edwards, talking about this. So I'm going to shut this down and we'll uh, let him begin.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Can you see me?
Yes.
Can you? Yeah. Can you guys can see me and hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let me start by saying that I am honored and flattered to have been invited to this seminar. And let me maybe I should have said this first. I'm at an airport, so it's not the ideal conditions, but that's where I am. And the reason why I am honored is that I'm not an economic historian. And being in the same cyber room with major historians is very flattering. Um, so, but I have moved towards economic history and history of thought during the last few years. And one of the books that I did is the one that Jean mentioned, the one on American default. And I'm very happy for your student who would hire right away because she talked about it. Let me also say that to me, I've been a professional economist, meaning by professional meaning since I got my PhD for more than 40 years. For me, moving towards these analytical narratives in book form has been enormously satisfying. Now, I started doing this work not only after I had tenure, but after I had an endowed chair. So I did not face the challenges that Jean mentioned, which I know are there and are very serious. I think that from a professional point of view, the ideal is to combine both approaches, and that's what I have tried to do in my work. For instance, in the book that Jean mentioned, the one on the American default, which is what transpired when the U.S. went off gold in April of 1933, and the gold clause on the debt of both private and public was abrogated. I wrote the book, and I wrote a number of papers with technical aspects, including one that Rui, who is in the seminar here, published when he was editing the journal. So I think that the combination of both things is very satisfying, and I've used now the word satisfying at least twice, and I think that that's one of the considerations. Of course, tenure and promotion is another one. If we want to talk to the public at large, I think that books are very important. The reason I am so let me try to do a narrative here. The reason I'm at the airport is because I was testifying in a large securities case, and I can tell you that the experts cite thousands of papers, and I can see the judge not being particularly impressed. That's my impression. But when books are cited, there is a different approach. So it depends on who your public is. Who are we writing for? And related to that is, what are the questions? There are some questions that I think are very important that it's very difficult to answer in article form. And in particular, there are some questions where the data are not good enough to do state-of-the-art econometrics. So what do we do about that? And I think that, again, that books are the way to go. So in my personal experience, I think that I think I started doing analytical narratives in a book I did on Tanzania. Now, Tanzania is an incredible case because it was the most important African case of African socialism. And under Nyerere, the country retrogressed for 15 years at a rate of about 2% decline or 3% decline per year, and then turned around, and it's considered to be now one of the African success stories. How did you tell the story? Okay, I wrote a paper, but it was 75 pages long. So no journal would publish it. Finally, it came out in a book. A book form was the ideal form, and it came out and it did quite well. American Default, the same story. You can do as I did. For instance, you can test as I did, and the Thomas Sargent hypothesis of regime change. When FDR announces we ain't going to be on the gold standard no more. That's April 19th, 1933. That's a regime change. What happened to the price of agricultural commodities? Well, we can get those prices daily, which we did. So you can do a very fine study. So you can combine both things. And I think that that's the way to present a body of work. Let me end. I want to end now this first round of this with something that's sort of a call for the profession, which of course no one will listen, but I think it's important. My field, as I said, is not economic history. It's international and development economics. And there was a form, a way of publishing in this field until about 20 years ago, which was the pamphlet. And the most important pamphlet series was done at Princeton. It was called the Princeton International Studies. And that series was run by Peter Cannon. And those were very highly respected. They didn't have a fixed number of pamphlets per year, but you could do 80 pages, 70 pages, narratives, lots of geometry. At that time, international trade was geometry. Tien Srinivasan from Yale, Jagdish Bhagwati, who at the time was MIT. And I think that intermediate length in terms of how one tells the story, it's something that we should try to recover, because that lends itself to combining both the more technical kind of work with econometrics and the analytical narrative. So let me stop there, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. Up next is Larry Neal. You can click on your video as well. There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the accompanying with such distinguished discussants on this panel. I'm going to try to share my screen with a PowerPoint they have. Boom. I think. Yeah, hope that shows up. I had very much the same experience recently as, well, not recently, but for this past several years that Eugene was describing, giving a seminar based on the exciting work I had uncovered at a visit to the Bering Archive. And I tried to give a number of seminars on it, but basically everybody said, no, it doesn't serve as a book. As an article, you need to have a book. So here's the book, which is currently in process, and I hope that it has some of the success that my previous books have had, and actually more, and maybe some of the success that Sebastian Edwards' work has had. But it started with a visit to Bering's, and you can see the book has 12 chapters now. It tries to lay out individually different aspects of why these financiers got involved in financing the Louisiana Purchase, and then how they carried out their project. And so all the seminars that I gave, a number of workshops, all of them with very sympathetic audiences, nobody ever suggested that it could be published as an article or even an MBER working paper, which would be the equivalent of the pamphlets that Sebastian mentioned that were so useful out of the Princeton project. Everybody said I needed to write a book, but then the question that came up in my mind and with various people was how to frame it. Eventually, I focused on the key individuals, which is why there's the book cover with one of the key individuals who's never mentioned in any of the literature dealing with the Louisiana Purchase, but who actually set up the whole deal in the first place. But okay, that was fine. Look at the individuals, but then I had to create what I'm using as a trope nowadays in consulting with would-be authors, a narrative arc. A narrative arc. So how do you get a narrative arc? There's different, I think you need it, whether you're talking about an article, a pamphlet, or a book. Let me state with articles, as a long-term journal editor, I had to deal with having people rephrase their articles for submission. And the general rule of thumb I had was lead with your punchline. Start with what you found at the end of your research. What is the point? Lead with your best shot, in other words. I had some experience as a bureaucrat with the OECD at one point in my career. And there, the whole idea of to be effective in writing memos to influence policymakers was to have an executive summary. Start with the executive summary. Later, when I was dealing with graduate students who were involved in business, I realized the equivalent would be have a 3-minute elevator pitch that you're trapped in an elevator. You want to put your idea out. You have to have the basic idea there that will communicate effectively while you're going from ground floor to the executive suites in the elevator. But the main thing is don't make the reader slog along with you, recounting all your tedious research efforts, trying this regression approach, that, and so on. With books, it's a little different. You have to start setting up the context. And I would argue then you highlight in that context the pot of gold that the reader will find at the end of the arc that, say, Dorothy reaches after she confronts successive constraints while going along the yellow brick road. So that's the idea on that. And for the book, this would be the pot of gold at the end would be, okay, how that whole thing got set up. So those are my basic ideas as approach. Reflecting on my own experience with dealing with articles or with books, I have to say that starting us off as an economic historian in an economics department, which was part of a business school at the time, I felt a great deal of pressure to write articles, and I did. And I wrote enough articles that I had the attention of my colleagues in the department, so they put me up for tenure. But then I found that when they sent out for letters of recommendation to economic historians, those articles in top economics journals had not been read by the senior people in the field of economic history. And indeed, one of my thesis advisors from Berkeley did mention in his letter that Larry hasn't written the book yet. And I realized that even the economists felt that I, as an economic historian, should be writing a book. So eventually I did write a book. And that book, then I thought, wow, I'm really going to get the attention of people now. But when I learned in the salary review that year, people who are determining my salary for the next year said, that book is just a collection of the articles he's already published. No big deal. And when that comment came back to me, I realized, okay, 4 of the chapters were based on previous articles that had been published, but of course it had to be redone to be a decent chapter in a book that had a narrative arc. And there were 9 chapters total. So it was a heck of an effort on my part, but it wasn't valued at all by my colleagues who, book schmuck. So that was a thing. And then since then, I've had to go back and forth between books and usually as textbooks. Eugene highlighted the I Am Not Master of Events book on the South Sea Bubble, which I had great hopes. I was it's still my favorite book. I still think it should be made into a movie, but it hasn't done nearly as well as I would have liked. I'm glad that Eugene students are reading it. So those are my comments, basically. Narrative arc, they're different things, but you've got to make the article effective by having your punchline at the outset, make sure people read it and get the point. The book has to have context, and it has to highlight the pot of gold that the reader can find if they slog through the entire book. One of the things I do, which I'm not sure is the wisest thing and everything, but there's a lot of material that in the book. I put that basically in appendices. So there are like 5 appendices that are pretty detailed, but I think nicely the storyline interfering with this. They would take too much effort to divert the reader from the storylines or the narrative arc, if you will. So that's something I'm hoping.
I don't know how everyone else, but
that
you seem to be
for
cutting
the
out a little bit,
economists-
Larry. So maybe we should.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Well, why don't we move on to Tobias at this point and
Okay.
so hopefully
Sorry.
you'll be more. Hopefully you'll have better, clearer transmission and questions. Tobias?
Okay. Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the invitation to this distinguished panel. I also have a couple of slides, very short one. I think you have.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Let me see. All right. Okay. Can't find it. Doesn't matter. It's only one slide. My background, I'm a trained historian, and I'm a professor of economic history at the history department. I also teach modern history. What moved me into monetary and financial history were the 1990s. I didn't have any idea about macroeconomic causes and consequences, but the Asian crisis really moved me. And also we in Switzerland at the time, we had a very long stagnation. I wanted to understand what was happening. And I didn't get any answers from historians. I didn't get any answers from economists really. So I thought you have to go into history. And then I moved into cliometrics. But I never learned the techniques. But the nice thing is you can work together with people, and I really have enjoyed this collaborative, this cooperation, and it's really rewarding for both sides, I think. But in my heart, I've always stuck to the narrative approach because that's where I come from, and I think it's a very good way to communicate with a greater public. Let me make three points. I think sometimes we think we are in weak positions, we the economic historians, but I think we are in a very strong position because we have learned to talk to different audiences inside and outside of academia. We are forced to do that, whereas the historians, they're not really forced to do that. They have a very closed community. I mean, I'm exaggerating, sorry, but that's how I observe it. And economists, they have their community, and we need to talk to both of them, and because we are quantitative and qualitative, we can talk to political scientists, but we can also talk to people who do literature. So I would really emphasize that we're in this very strong position. And as both Sebastian and Larry already told us, I mean, books are really important to communicate with a wider community, and they're also PR for our discipline. I think whenever I talk to people outside of academia, if they are interested in history, they know a couple of economic history books. They really have a great appreciation for our discipline. So I see the whole question is rather a question of portfolio. We are a very heterogeneous crowd. Sometimes that's maybe difficult because we cannot communicate with each other, and some people think there is only one way to do economic history. But in general, I think it's a heterogeneous crowd. It's a tolerant crowd, and that's a big strength because we can reach to all sorts of audiences inside and outside of academia. Second point, policy making. My experience has been that policymakers or bank managers, central bankers, they really love the narrative approach because it's much closer to their daily experience, especially during crises. And I mean, it doesn't help them if you tell them, well, I just run a regression and in 3 out of 10 cases, I can predict that you will fail to contain the financial crisis. That's not what they want to hear. So I think for financial and monetary history, especially for these very exciting crisis periods, the narrative approach is much closer to policymaking. The cliometric approach is probably better for these long-term economic policies or education policy questions of inequality and all that. So it's not a contradiction, but I think for crisis management, the narrative approach is indispensable. And then the last point, and my predecessor have already talked about that. I think what's really great about the narrative approach is it forces you to go to an archive, and usually you discover things and new questions you would never have seen just by studying the literature. So it's very rewarding because you see all of a sudden, well, that's interesting for such a paper, but for another paper or for a book, there is a lot of interesting additional information. And then also for the research agenda, my experience has been that people who are very well have econometric techniques, they have a great appreciation if you provide them, even in a paper, if you provide an interesting framing for the whole paper, even if it's a very technical paper, they like to have somebody who thinks more maybe in political terms or in historical terms, or just knows a lot about the context, knows a lot about the political debates of the time. And this is actually one reason why I never try to learn all these econometric techniques, because people told me, well, you already have a comparative advantage. Just stick to that and try to develop your understanding of the techniques from, on a very basic level, but you don't have to enter into the same field. We very much appreciate your contribution. So that's my last point. So summing up, I think of the whole thing as a portfolio. I think we are very valuable for policymaking. And third, we are very valuable, the narrative people are very valuable for the expansion of the research agenda. Okay, thank you. That's it.
So I'd like to abuse my position as chair to just make one point, pick up with something which Sebastian Edwards said. That is, oftentimes the techniques of econometrics are, we can't really apply them perfectly to something we want to study. And what comes to mind actually is the South Sea bubble, because people in all the bubbles will have want to do all these tests of rationality and test whether you do or do not have a bubble, and yet the methods are rather weak for making some determination. And in fact, what one really needs to do is know a little bit to understand a little more of their dynamics, is to see, for example, how did Isaac Newton bet on the South Sea bubble? A very informative case. But then to understand the real political dynamics between this or any other bubble, for instance, Larry's book on Lord Londonderry and the diamond and just John Law really shows the interaction. It's to talk about the South Sea bubble and not know that a leading figure in the British government had dinner with John Law, and they made a bet in which John Law laid off some of the bet afterwards, tells you that you're missing some part of the story, which is very vital understanding. So I think that's where you really need both techniques together, but it's really striking, I think, in that case. So I'm going to let, given my eyesight's a little bit limited today, to let Nathan and Rui handle the questions in the chat.
Of which there are none yet, but I'm sure they will show up as we go along. So again, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A or just raise your electronic hand, and we'll.
So while we wait for questions, maybe let me react, if I may, to what was said. I loved what both of my co-panelists said. I think the term that Tobias used, portfolio, it's a great way of summarizing what I think should be done and what I tried to convey. So analytical narrative. The analytical part, if the data are available, we need to use some of the techniques that the economics profession uses, or rely on them. I think the analytical part requires that. And the narrative part has to do with what Larry was saying. I like the narrative arc idea. I would go even further and talk that, if possible, do a hero's journey type of analysis. And in my American Default book, there were several heroes, but FDR was the hero. And then Ray Moley, the chief advisor from the Brains Trust, and I went into the archives and looked at his diary and all of that, and it was fascinating. And then, as I said, FDR's main concern, or one of his main concerns, was the price of agricultural commodities. And then you can do all sorts of analyses using daily data. So the portfolio, I think, comes in very, very nicely. And let me just say that two more things very briefly. Journal articles, in general, the way you do it is very linear. The writing is very linear. Analytical narratives, the writing can be, like Larry says, the punchline first, or you can interweave all sorts of stories. There's a lot of freedom and creativity there. And finally, what Tobias said, for policymaking, I mean, let's take one example that is at the heart of today's policy discussion, at least in some part of the world. Should Javier Milei, the new president of Argentina, push with dollarization? We cannot answer that question unless we do analytical narratives and go to the history. And that the way to approach that, I think, is we ask, has it ever been tried before? And if it was tried before, how did it work? And only people who do the kind of work that we do are able to answer those questions. And for Argentina, and for many countries, whether to have their own currency, it's absolutely key. And we can provide an enormous service by doing that kind of research. That's it for now.
Okay, so let me abuse my position as co-organizer of this series, and throw two ideas at you, right? So you mentioned two big thoughts in your interventions. One is the distinction between a narrative approach and a statistical based approach. Sebastian, you just mentioned again analytical narratives, which are already a subset within the narrative approach. Let's put it that way. And the other one is the difference between writing a book and writing a paper, and they're related, right? So for instance, in the case of Larry's example, right, why he needed to write a book about the Lutheran purchase, because the story was too involved and complex, and there were too many dramatis personae, right, to be able to fit with that punchline kind of method of writing papers. But so my question is whether is there a way of separating the two, right? So is there a way of writing different kinds of papers? Right, so my historian colleagues, they write papers as well, right? When they write papers for, I don't know, past and present or the American historical journal, they don't write the way we economic historians write for economic publications, right? So the almost lab report way in which economists write papers these days, it's dominant these days, but maybe it's not fate, right? So maybe I would like to hear your ideas about that, right? And then the second wild idea, right? People sometimes ask me when they realize I'm an economic historian and they don't know what that means, right? Are you an economist, are you an historian? They ask me, so what's economic history, right? I guess the answer I always revert to is to say that what's the distinction, namely between economics or history and economic history, economics and economic history, and of course there's differences. But one of the things I think is a necessary condition is that you cannot write economic history about the period for which the archives are not open, right? And this relates with what all of you have been mentioning. There are things that you cannot answer with statistics. Frequently, statistical analysis can completely miss the point, right? But trying to write narrative history without having access to the full archival evidence is also probably a problem. I don't know who wants to pick.
Well, I'm going to be very brief because I cannot resist. My new book, Rui, is about Salvador Allende's socialist years. I'm working on that. So I am interviewing all the surviving members of the cabinet. You know that the president committed suicide in the presidential palace on September 11, 1973. So I go to Fernando Flores, who held 4 different cabinet positions, and I say, Fernando, can I check your personal archives? And he gets furious. He said, he told me, I was in prison for 3 years or 4 years. I was expelled of the country with my underwear and nothing else. And and he used the F word, think that I have an archive? And so there are times where we don't have archives and we still need to tell that story.
Great example. Yeah, point taken. Does anyone want to pick any of these two ideas?
Well, I would say one thing about that is that, this is about most of the times the analytical statistical approach is a deductive approach. You set up your hypothesis, you see what the implications are. But I find sometimes the most creative work is when I go to the archives or I'm reading a story and seeing what contradictions, because there's oftentimes when something's not told correctly, analyzed correctly, there's a contradiction. And then trying to say, what's the right question to ask? And that's an inductive process. And I think that's inherent in a narrative. Like, why does something particularly happen? And for instance, in my own case, all this in the Barings crisis, all this Barings paper is flooding into the Bank of England. People want to rediscount it with the bank and get rid of it. Why doesn't the bank take any action? And that to me is a question, well, why doesn't it? So I have to find out why, and I have to ask the right question to get the answer. And the answer is because Lord Baring is head of the discount committee. That's something which is not known as part of the story, but it's vital to understand in many cases how the conflicts of interest inform the problems of financial crises. So it's oftentimes finding the right question, which is, I say, and I think chiefly as an inductive process, and sometimes reading the archives. will give you a very different view on what's happened and pose all kinds of questions. You just think of what's a better question to ask. That's oftentimes even the most important step one has to take.
Right. Yeah, can I just jump in? Yeah, I fully agree, and that's the nice thing about going to archives. That's what was my last point. I mean, you're constantly surprised, but you still can develop a very analytical narrative afterwards. Some historians don't succeed in doing that. They're just telling a story. But I mean, the ambition has always to be it has to be very analytical, and I think even a book has to be, in a way, has to be more analytical than a paper, because you have to think through how you tell the story, what character will come at what time, and how you what has to be excluded. So in a way, it's analytically much more challenging than writing a paper. So this contradiction is maybe sometimes overdone. As for the possibility of transforming economics papers, I don't think that's possible, but that has nothing to do with economics. It has to do with academic competition. And I think, again, our weakness, that we're not able to define what economic history really is our big advantage. It gives us enormous degree of freedom. And you don't have this degree of freedom you don't have it anymore in your research at the university. Look at economics 50 years ago. You could basically do whatever you wanted. That's not possible, especially for young scholars. And we are in a niche. We're like a decathlon. We still can do everything. You know, we can run around. We can throw stones. We can do everything. And I think we should really be kind of unclear what we're really doing. It gives us a lot of freedom, and maybe the only thing I agree is archives, but that means anything. I mean, that's not a constraint. On the contrary, so I'm very happy with this unclear definition of our discipline.
Larry, you want to come in, or?
Well, I'm just reflecting on my own experience in an economics department, and being confronted with the issue I mentioned at the outset of my career of finding that I wasn't really well known by economic historians because I hadn't published a book, and but I had articles in top economics journals, but that made me look like I was just strictly a cliometrician, and I was happy to do that, but for a while. But I did want to get more reputation, and I did want to say that in that first book that had the 9 chapters, 5 of which were totally new. One of the things that made it popular for economists was I put all the data that I had in a data appendix. So it was online and available for people who really wanted to get into the data. And so that's a useful thing as well. And not to make the data possibly, the make readers slog through it, but make it available. And I think that with the current technology, it's just fantastic, the possibilities that are coming on. So Rui, as a recent editor, you could put people's appendices online and don't have to take up journal space with the data. That's something that I didn't have available at the time. And even better now for the access to archives is that Barings and Rothschilds and increasingly the National Archives in Britain are digitizing, and I think the Dutch are way ahead on this, on digitizing archives and making them available. So I just got something like 350 pages of documents from the Staatsarchief in Amsterdam, for example, which were saved me the expense of flying to Amsterdam. So That's amazing. The possibilities are terrific for us now.
All right. On that positive note, let me pass to David Vines, who's been patiently waiting to ask a question. David, you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
We can.
And you might or might not be able to see me.
We see a picture of you.
Can I? Well, you can have to put up with the picture.
That's fine.
It's a very flattering picture.
Thank you. It stops me from waving one of my favorite books. What I want to say has got two parts, and it goes to something which Doug Owen said to me. Doug put me on to Ronald Finlay, and I think Ronald Finlay's which whatever they are lectures, the wonderful why am I stumbling in remembering which the Olin lectures in 1996 called Factor Proportions, Trade and Growth. And the project that he outlines in this book and that he did in his career was to only go traveling in economic history when he had a really clear theoretical question to ask. And Ronald was a theorist who did history, and it's an inspirational project. And I think quite a lot of economic history gets done with implicit theory, and writing out the theory carefully first can, I think, be enormously helpful. The second thing I'll do is a bit of self-advertisement, a perpetually not finished book, which I'm writing about the development of Australian capability in managing a successful open economy, really over the last 100 years. And it turns out to be a story about 8 key individuals. Can't do it without narrative history, but it is also a story about a development of a particular school of analysis. And so I can't do it without having first really understood the open economy macro that these Australian people thought they were implementing. And I approach it as someone as an open economy macro theorist. And some of these people are either still doing the stuff, they're at the end of my history, or they were pupils of people, or they were pupils of pupils 2 generations back. And I can reverse engineer how extraordinarily important theory was to what they were doing. And I don't think I would have been able to see this as the project that I was engaged with if Doug Owen hadn't made me read the Finlay book. And that's why I'd love to be waving that book at you in this intervention. Thanks very much.
I think we have Gail Triner. Is that?
Yes, I'll allow Gail to speak now. You can unmute yourself, Gail. Okay, while she gets her bearing. David again? You forgot something?
Okay.
Oh, there
Okay,
you are. Go ahead. Yeah.
Am I there?
You are.
Okay. So as some of you know, I am an historian, so I'm really happy to, hear this sort of parade of economists talking about the narrative approach. And I think one common underlying theme that many of you are talking about is that the ways in which narrative can really expand and deepen our understanding of causation, which is sort of, the center of economists sort of thinking about things. But one thing that I would like to hear more about, which I haven't heard much of, is a way that I think in the future might actually bring narrative and quantification closer together, and economists and a way of bringing economists and historians closer together, which is that there are a lot of new techniques for analyzing narrative. And so I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that, on those possibilities, and certainly any experiences about that, because I think that's where we've got you know, some innovation that could be useful for us. That's my question.
Wow.
Anyone wants to pick this up? Yeah.
That's beyond my expertise for sure. But I think that the younger generation looking at ways to analyze the amount of data that come bombarding us through social media, and then with the efforts of archivists to do the digitization, doing the kind of analytics of word counts or themes that come up in different time periods. That's very interesting, but it probably is something that the younger generation will want to use artificial intelligence applications to carry out.
So
If I'm understanding what Gail has in mind there.
So one of the ways is can you make text into data? And I think this is very useful, but again, it depends on the program, because the ultimate goal is to find some parsimonious set of variables in terms of the text, which will explain events. And that puts it back in really the sort of camp of looking at economic numerical variables. And I don't think it replaces the narrative. It may help in certain cases in looking at certain types of actions, but I don't think it really replaces the linear narrative, because it's not quite the same thing. Now, there may be another approach, but the most common, I think, so far has been the turning text into data. So I'll let someone else, I hope. The last thing I wanted to say, we haven't talked much about teaching. And I think this is very important for the next generation, because there's a tendency of our students, both undergraduate and graduate, to not want to read long things. And I found it very useful to make sure that they read one full book for cover to cover in both undergraduate and graduate class. And that turns out to be very good for them, because they rarely do that in their economics classes. They may do it in history classes, but not economics. And I think it really conditions them to be more open to looking at a narrative in the future. So that's my one recommendation. Any other?
Yeah, I fully agree with both points. I mean, it's very useful, but it doesn't replace the analytical thinking about the narrative. It helps a lot, but it's not. And sometimes you really have to read the original source once or twice or even 3 times until you really understand what's going on. And you have to go back and forth between different sources and contexts. And it's very time consuming. And I'm sure you can accelerate the process, but it's not possible to replace it, unfortunately. You still need a lot of time to write a book. And teaching, yes, I fully agree. You have to force them. You have to put them in prison and give them a book and tell them you cannot leave prison until you've read the book. It's hard, but
So
never give up.
Maybe I
we
can
have
jump in okay, with my 2 bits. So yeah, I mean, this AI, I mean, the AI revolution is something we have to really think about in terms of the books. What I keep telling the students here is, in the end, AI will do almost anything that we do in economics journals and regressions and those kind of things. And again, the storytelling will become the art. And I guess the books are the ones that are gonna stay on the shelves much longer after some new statistical methods discards a lot of the stuff we did with in the past with more data or better analysis. So so I encourage them to think about storytelling, even if they're not economic historians, because that's the only thing I would think that would be left after AI does its thing to the fullest. And then the big dilemma is obviously on reading books, because again, assigning books and longer items to read to students, what I've discovered they do, and I don't know how you can circumvent that, is loaded onto some AI. Even now, Adobe PDF already gives you the option to summarize automatically whatever you load. So, so how do you go about that in terms of writing the future books? So I agree, storytelling should be the thing. I think that will have the shelf life and interest. But how do you write stories? How do you engage people to read more than 20 or 30 pages of even a good story?
So let me try to say, I'll have to go and catch my flight, but I think that combining Gail's question with what everyone else has said, new techniques, we can now, I think, use old techniques in a much more granular way. So, for instance, event studies, very old technique, very old approach. But now that, say, the New York Times and the Times of London, almost every newspaper has been digitalized, you can find a much more granular sequence of events. In my latest book, which is it's been a very successful, and it has surprised me, which is on the story of the Chicago boys. You could go and find when was the term neoliberal used for the first time by the New York Times in its current understanding. And you can find the exact day, and then you can follow how it became used more and more and more, and how different variations. And that you could do sort of before by going to the microfiche. So I think it's the opportunities are infinite. And I agree that at the end, we are going to do most of the storytelling, which is essential.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, we've exhausted about an hour so far. If there aren't any more questions, I certainly would like to announce that the next session on March the 27th will be Howard Bordenhorn discussing the market, extent of the market for banknotes in America. And that should be a regular session and a great paper. So thank you all for attending.
We give ourselves the luxury of extra 15 minutes. So if there's ongoing wish to debate, we're perfectly fine with staying. Sebastian had to leave to catch a plane, as you heard, but we can carry on.
So I'm going to bow out because I have a doctor's appointment. No surprise, upcoming. But thank you guys very much for putting it on. I noted that there are 80 participants at the peak, which is I think a really good audience. And
absolutely,
well done.
It's a great series. Okay, bye, Eugene.
Bye.
All right. Okay, so maybe this is the natural point to stop. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks a lot for your discussion, for your ideas and thoughts, and let's hope this is the beginning of the re-energization of narrative history in macroeconomics. It will be, a shot in the arm that will make it even more relevant. Thanks again. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.